I'm Jon Ray. I am the Environmental Sustainability Manager for the Gardens, Libraries and Museums at the University of Oxford, which is a bit of a mouthful, but that covers the Bodleian Libraries, Botanic Gardens and Arboretum, and the 4 museums, so the Ashmolean, the Pitt Rivers Museum, History of Science, and the Museum of Natural History. Well, we're seeing it sort of manifest in different ways, and we're just starting our journey on this topic of climate adaptation. Everyone's very focused, as they should be, on sort of climate mitigation. So essentially, what can we do to reduce our footprint? But we know that we're already seeing the impact of climate change, and how we adapt to that is termed climate adaptation. And so we're seeing it in 4 areas really. So how it impacts our staff, how it impacts our buildings and collections, our visitors, and our sort of commercial and financial positions. And so from a staff perspective, heat is particularly our sort of real challenge. We have spaces for staff that are getting increasingly warm, and sort of worried about sort of working conditions. The Museum of Natural History has a glass roof, is a glorious 1860s building, but has a glass roof, and that's very susceptible for very hot temperatures in the summer, which impacts visitors. From a buildings and collections perspective, we're working on our sort of storage of our objects, but we do still have objects stored in basement areas, and we know that these are subject to things like soil heave. The Oxford is based on a clay basin, which is slowly drying out, similar to London, and so again, that's sort of changing the sort of the atmosphere of those basement spaces. So we're already seeing that. From a visitor perspective, we are seeing these challenges around increased rainfall at certain times of year or increased warm temperatures. One of the great opportunities, though, this doesn't all have to be negative, is the opportunity to offer cool spaces. So the Cool Off in Culture campaign that's led by the BFI is a really great example of how we can sort of think about this differently and sort of help drive people into our sort of spaces. And then the final sort of piece is about sort of that commercial aspect, that financial aspect, is sort of increasing volatility. So how we ensure our spaces can become potentially more variable. The costs of that, as it becomes warmer, are we going to have to use more electricity to keep our sort of collections or our sort of spaces at a sort of stable temperature? And are things like food supplies or visitor travel patterns going to change as things change? So sort of really a sort of a wide variety, and I'll probably say as a piece, some of these aspects we may have already identified or be thinking about, but climate change is really a sort of amplifier of existing risks. So it's really sort of starting to turn up the volume on some of those pieces that we may already be thinking about. Well, fortunately, there is lots of data in this space. So if I just share my screen for a second, and just wanted to share sort of a couple of bits. And the sort of first bit was the sort of case for change. And 2025, I think, was a really great example of a case for change. In springtime, we particularly saw a very dry spring. We saw this the driest spring on record. 2025 went on to be the warmest and sunniest summer, and so we've got all this data that's sort of starting to tell us that we're seeing the impact of climate change already, and when we start to look at maps of what's happening in the UK. And so this is a map of precipitation in the 80s and 90s and noughties on the left-hand side. And we're expecting a UK average overall increase of 11% rainfall by around sort of 2050. And so we're seeing this huge dynamic, but it's quite regionalized, it's quite localized. And so it's really important to sort of start to break this down by where we're actually based. Otherwise, it's quite abstract. But We have an amazing resource, particularly in the UK, available to us called the Local Authority Climate Explorer. And if you just Google this or follow some of the links we can provide, you can go in, you can essentially, when you land on it, on the top right-hand side, you can select your local authority and it will generate a climate report for your local authority. And that includes what are some of the hazards that you maybe want to think about, but it'll include very bespoke, very specific information to your area. So it'll start to say, okay, this is what's happened over the last 20, 40 years in terms of temperature, in terms of rainfall, and this is what's expected to happen in the future in different scenarios, but it's all very accessible. So it starts to allow you to identify what some of the potential hazards are that we may see in the future. And the other resource that I think is really useful is flood maps from the Environment Agency. Often people already see these. These are sort of known things, but we can start to sort of access flood maps, and the Environment Agency publishes what they're forecasting flooding to look like in the future. So again, if you use these two resources together, they can sort of start to provide that data set of what are the potential hazards that we're facing in the future. So I think that the sort of practical steps I split into three areas. The first is that sort of what are the sort of hazards, and so that's where the local authority tool, the Environment Agency, can start to identify what are the sort of potential pieces. Then say just talking to people. It doesn't have to be a hugely formal process. It doesn't have to be a complicated piece, but actually talking to people, because people may already start to see elements like different pests in the collections, or changes to the building, or changes to visiting patterns. But bringing colleagues together to sort of have that conversation about what are the things that they're worried about, what are, based on that sort of data and the things that we're starting to see changing, what are the things that are in their heads, and just writing that down starts to help us identify what the risks are. And then the final piece is then, okay, well, what are we going to do about that? What are the things that we're really worried about? And some of the things are going to be really complicated that we can't easily fix. They might be building related, they might require lots of money, and so having them written down is important in itself, because it'll start to allow us to have the conversation and think about how we're going to tackle it. But some of the other things are more straightforward things that we could just think about. So one of the examples for us is in Oxford is we staff don't always know what they should do when it's very hot. So should they stay at work? Should they go at home? Should they? What's our sort of approach there? And so we need to sort of do a little piece of work to sort of start to help people understand what are the sort of expectations. Otherwise, we have some people, when it's not too hot, will scoot off, and other people will sort of suffer, and it's sort of 40 degrees. So we need to be sort of consistent, and we need to support our colleagues through this. But I think that having a plan gives structure, reviewing that plan ongoing, then gives that sort of consistency. This is a medium to long-term piece of work, so but it's important to start early, because all of this is about building resilience within our institutions.